Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Sunday, November 11th, and I'm doing a Q&A session. So in these Q&A sessions, basically what I do is I sit down and I answer questions that I've been getting in emails from all of you. So first of all, thank you for your questions. They're really great opportunities for everybody to learn, including myself, because every time I'm asked a question, a lot of the times I've really got to think about it. And I think one of the best parts about uh, learning astrology is the opportunity to really think carefully about astrological theory. Something that one of my favorite astrologers, Robert Schmidt, once said that I will never forget is that the study of astrology itself, separate from the prognostication powers of astrology, is a worthy endeavor. It's something that stimulates the mind, and it in fact it engages almost like a puzzle solving ability in our brain, and it's especially true when you're studying ancient astrology, where there was so much there were so many interconnecting patterns in the way that the early astrology was organized, and the way that the delineation methods worked and things like that. So I always appreciate questions and having the chance to think about astrology as much as doing astrology. So hopefully these little Q&A sessions are also useful for all of you. So I'm going to go through some questions. They're very random, so I'll give you a preview of what we're going through before each one, and then I'll dive into it. So this question comes from Karen, who is wondering about the distinction, again, between the 10th house, whole sign 10th house, and the midheaven. And let me just say that the whole sign 10th house and the midheaven is something I've already covered in a Q&A, but her specific question is, what is the difference between the two in terms of how they are, how do you work with them in like delineating or interpreting a chart? Now, I have an answer to this just based on my practice, and I think you'll find that other other astrologers who practice traditional astrology are very similar. My colleague Chris Brennan comes to mind, who I know uses the two whole sign 10th and the midheaven very interchangeably in delineation. So for example, my wife has the midheaven in her 9th whole sign house, not the 10th. But she owns a yoga studio, right? We own a yoga studio together, but that's her career, right? So 9th house is a place of religion and spirituality, and something like yoga, as well as a higher education that she's had to get to become a medical herbalist. Those are 9th house matters. So the fact that the midheaven falls into the 9th house also suggests that there is a correlation with 9th house topics. So they're kind of overlapped. But then her 10th whole sign house, right? She has a bunch of planets, and they also really adequately represent what she does for a living. She's got a bunch of planets in Aries in the 10th house. She's an entrepreneur. So it's just simple stuff like that, where you'll see there's overlap between the 10th house and the midheaven. Sometimes they're in the same house. The midheaven will be in the 10th whole sign house if you're using whole sign house system. Sometimes it'll fall in the 11th. I had a client who worked with a group of friends that was a very powerful sort of allegiance between friends. It's an 11th house topic, friends, that formed their company together, midheaven in the 11th house. They had planetary planets in the 10th that also had something to do with their career. So remember one thing. The midheaven is a place of maximal ascendancy in terms of the meridian degree of the midheaven. That is a place where the planet reaches its maximum altitude in the sky. And so one of the ways that I've always had of thinking about the midheaven has been in terms of a planet reaching its ascendancy. When something is lifted up on high, it means that it has a certain kind of prominence. Like, you can't miss that planet in your life right now. And so the archetypal themes of that planet maybe just be very strong in your life. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will be strong in your career at the same time, though when something is maximally sort of visible, it's often playing a role in a more public sphere of life. Well, for most of us, that might be career. Maybe it's infamy, or maybe it's fame. But for a lot of us, like, the most visible place in the sky is going to have to do with what we do out in the world, the things that we're known for. But I always also make the distinction that a planet at the midheaven can have something to do with something being on display in your life. Like, when Venus ascends to the midheaven, sometimes people get married. I think it still can, and I'm talking about when it ascends to the midheaven by transit, for example, or by progression or something like that. So just give you an example. So hopefully that answers your question, Karen, about the difference between the 10th, 11th, 9th. I believe that the topical significations of the 9th or the 11th kind of blend together with the 10th house topics. And that's how I see most Hellenistic astrologers treating it. So, okay, that's that question. Lisa has a question about nodal returns and reverse nodal returns. Is this a significant transit to pay attention to? Yeah, for sure. She then asks, what do planets do when they, how do they behave when they are near the nodes? So here's the thing, is that the nodes of the moon in our charts, in modern astrology, people practice evolutionary astrology, have a very specific set of beliefs about them. They believe the North Node represents your future and the growth lessons that you're trying to embody or learn in this lifetime, or something that you're heading toward in the future. And the South Node represents the past, the lessons and gifts already learned, as well as the old karma that needs to be let go of. So valid. Nope. I mean, that's what evolutionary astrologers believe. That's fine. It is not traditional, in the sense that the North Node of the moon traditionally was associated with gain, increase, and augmentation. It was associated with the planet Jupiter. The South Node more related to Saturn, and decrease, loss, or decline. Indian astrology is, I really love their take on the North and South Node. North Node is in some ways more about appetite. South Node is about austerity, you could say. So where the North Node is associated with gain, it can also complexify or complicate your life, because, you know, more money, more problems kind of situation. Whereas the South Node may reduce or take things away from you materially, but when we lose things materially, it's possible that that's actually a very auspicious thing for us spiritually, because most spiritual practices require that we start detaching from things in the material world in order to focus on the inner life. So if you've ever lost someone, it often immediately reminds you of what's important. So the South Node of the moon in Indian astrology is sometimes just looked at as more auspicious, even though it's associated with things that most people would agree are more challenging. The nodes of the moon in your chart are, two places associated with fortune. They are the nodes of the moon, and the moon represents fortune. Fortune means things that happen, circumstantial events in your life. One kind of event, North Node, is going to be about gain. One that's more about decline. One that's about maybe gain that complexifies. Two, loss that maybe deepens or wisens. So some different ways of thinking about it. But when the nodes of the moon go through their 18 to 19-year cycle, then they, in a sense, it's like any other great planetary cycle. They return to their home places. Astrologers pay a lot of attention to them because the eclipses are going to start falling in the same signs that they were in when you were born. And eclipses that are falling in the same signs that were happening roughly when you were born are thought to be, major times of destined events. Basically, they're more significant or powerful destined events around those times. When you go back to the halfway point, when the nodes are flipped, you have the South Node on your North Node, or the transiting North Node on your South Node, and they're flipped around, which will happen about 9 years into the cycle. That's also a big moment, but sometimes you could read it as, gains that come through losses, or losses that come with gains. It's that kind of a thing where the gain loss feature in your life is sort of flipped around. That's another, just another very interesting way of thinking about it. For in either case, though, the eclipses are falling in the same signs. They're just constellating around South Node and North Node opposite the way that they were arranged at birth at the 9-year halfway point. So very important peaks and, peaks of fortune, you could say. Just eclipses falling in those same signs are just a big deal. How do planets behave when they're near the nodes? There's a saying in ancient astrology that the North Node increases both the good and the bad, and the South Node decreases both the good and the bad. So when you have a planet of gain like Jupiter coming around your North Node, it will increase both the good and the bad. Jupiter will get even bigger and more grandiose, possibly more arrogant. Mars will get even more Mars-like, but maybe that's more courageous. Maybe it's more belligerent. So it could be either the good or the bad of Mars just getting amplified a bit. Whereas if a planet's coming around the south node, you're thinking it's being decreased or limited. Well, if that's Mars, then it could be curbing the appetites or the fight response. That might be a good thing. Or it could be, if Mars is around the south node, could be decreasing your will to do something that you need to do, which is like a feeling of being, impotent or weak or something like that. So you got to think about those kinds of effects around the nodes. Now, that is that question. And another part of the question was, what can we expect from the nodes moving into Cancer and Capricorn? Well, it's a Moon-Saturn kind of dynamic, right? Those are the domicile rulers of Cancer and Capricorn. So Moon-Saturn, you have a lot of things relating to the public and issues about what is harming or helping the public, tribe, national, family kinds of interests. The Moon is traditionally related to the public and the people. Also, Saturn is the limiting effect, what damages, what harms, what limits, what is restrictive. So, the people and oppression, as well as, working through some growing pains or maturity, maybe among groups, families, the general population. You go back to the last time the eclipses were happening in Cancer and Capricorn, you're going back to like a summer of 2010. I remember there were some. And you're thinking it wasn't long after that era of the Cancer Capricorn eclipses where he has started in with the Occupy Wall Street movement. And there was, other things going on around then as well. But the Arab Spring, that kind of thing. So I might be getting my timeline off just a little bit there, but let me just look while I have my chart handy. Let's see. Okay, so I don't think I'm too far off on that. Let's see. I think that it's gonna be, yeah, interesting. It's about the summer. It starts in the summer of 2009, the last time the nodes were in Cancer and Capricorn. And it goes through it goes all the way through into the winter of 2011. So that's roughly the timeline, which is, I think that's just before the Arab Spring, actually. I think it was spring of 2011. So I can't think off the top of my head. I should have been more prepared for this particular question. I'll have to take a look and get back, like what was going on back then. But you think about things with the moon, like tribe, family, nation, and then you think of, Saturn, you think of impediments or struggles within those places, and also maturing and growing up in those areas. So those are some things to think about, generally speaking, but you can also think about the relationship between the moon and the more vulnerable places of life, the mothering instinct versus the more hard, distant, remote, paternal kind of Saturn quality. So those two things may also be a little tense or, more dynamically opposed in the next couple of years. So we've just had Leo and Aquarius eclipses. So you definitely feel the shift this winter with the eclipses coming up. So I have to dig, I promise you guys I'll do a more thorough treatment of the shift of nodes and the meaning of the eclipses coming up in Cancer and Capricorn, because I've been meaning to do something on that anyway. So stay tuned for that. All right, next question. Would you please talk about the void of course moon? I've read that in ancient astrology, it had a different meaning when in Jupiter and the moon's signs, and depending on the last aspect the moon made to a planet. Okay, so basic old school definition is actually called running in the void, and it means that there's a planet that has, it's not going to make an aspect to any other planet within the next 30 degrees, or the moon is not going to make an aspect in the next 30 degrees to any planet, regardless of if it moves across a sign boundary or not. That's called running in the void. It's a very rare condition. It was thought to be not so great. Void of course moon later in the traditions comes to mean basically if the moon is not going to make an aspect to any other planet in the sky prior to leaving the current sign that it's in, then it is said to be void of course. And there is sometimes it's said that things go hardly on. William Lilly said this, and sometimes it's been interpreted to mean that nothing much happens, when actually I think probably a better interpretation is that when during void of course moons, things may proceed, but there's just sometimes a sense of burden or difficulty or struggle that goes along with it. It's not, they don't proceed easily. That's an idea. I don't work with void of course moons a ton unless I'm doing horary charts, but yeah. And then the idea that it's not, the void of course problem is sort of mitigated in the signs of the moon is obvious, because in those signs the moon is in its own power, so a little bit easier. And in Jupiter's signs, because Jupiter is the benefic, greater benefic, and helps things happen. So that would be that. That's why moon is void of course, but not necessarily debilitated, or not hindered as much if it were in Taurus or Cancer, exaltation of the moon and moon's domicile, or in Pisces or Sagittarius, which are Jupiter signs. Okay, so thank you, Iris, for that question. All right, let's see. We already answered this one about 3 to 5 must-have books, so I hope I didn't answer the one on void of course moon already. I don't even know if I did. If I could discuss the difference between Saturn's rulership function in Capricorn versus Aquarius. Well, yeah, so one's feminine and one's masculine. Capricorn is Saturn's feminine domicile, and Aquarius is Saturn's masculine domicile. Aquarius has no cooperative exaltation lord, whereas Capricorn has Mars as its cooperative exaltation lord. So quite simply, Capricorn is a feminine sign. It's more relational, and it shares some affinities or responsibilities of rulership with Mars. In Aquarius, it kind of stands on its own a bit more. This is typical of the yin and the yang. Yang is a bit more independent. Yin is a bit more relational or dependent. So Saturn's yin side also, you could say, points to a more archetypally feminine Saturn. How to describe that? When I think of feminine Saturn, I think of the wise woman, or I think of the earthy hermit living in the woods, or I think of the practical, earthy, realist, a survivalist in nature kind of image, or even someone who is, sometimes you see Capricorn in even fantasy writers like J.R.R. Tolkien. Had the sun in Capricorn in the 5th house, if I'm not mistaken, and just a world builder. It's just kind of, there's a strong fantasy element to Capricorn. It's a very feminine sign. It's a sea goat, and you can't forget that the sea goat is a mythical image. In fact, it was one of the only signs, along with Sagittarius, that was literally called mythical. Like now we think of everything as mythic because we all just we just have downed like a 2-liter of Joseph Campbell, right? But in ancient astrology, it was not mythology. The gods were real. The myths might have been illustrations of the work of the gods, but they were thought to be real. This is not playing around here. And as someone who happens to believe that gods are real, I don't love the way that sometimes we sort of very clinically and academically sort of talk about they were these stories, and it's really just, it's all just a part of your behavior. So I don't like the behaviorizing of everything in astrology, and then we say it's all mythological, but what we really mean is it's all sort of clinical psychology with a literary, educational background or something. I believe that the gods are real. In that case, it's interesting that there were 2 signs that were literally called mythical, and Capricorn was actually called the goat-horned one, or the goat-horned kind of question mark. It's a very enigmatic sign, Capricorn, and Capricorn as related to fantasy and science fiction is a very strong correspondence in fantasy and science fiction writers' charts with Capricorn. I think it's the sun in Tolkien's chart that's in Capricorn. That's such a big deal. But at any rate, the point I'm trying to make is that Saturn and Capricorn can be not just kind of hard, cold. Like a lot of people, Pluto and Capricorn, they're like, oh, Pluto and Capricorn, it's all about patriarchy. And this is not altogether true. It can be about that kind of opportunistic, Machiavellian, cutthroat, advance and succeed at all costs. Like that can be Saturn in Capricorn, but and Pluto in Capricorn right now. But it can also be about this really kind of dreamlike quality of trying to build worlds. That's kind of a Saturn in Capricorn thing. When you switch over to Capricorn or Saturn in Aquarius, it's a totally different feeling. Saturn in Aquarius is much more mental. It's an air sign, right? So it's much more mental. It's much more sort of abstract and a little more dissociated, has more of the feeling of lofty and liminal ideas and intellectual space. The idea of outsider or marginalized ideas and thought, systems of thought. It just has a much more sort of, again, sort of lofty, ethereal, intellectual, and rational quality to it. And that's the primary way that I would think of the difference. I am just flying through these, so if I had more time, I'd come up with some chart examples for you. But for example, one example is that you'll often see, Saturn in Aquarius in people's charts that are like engineers, like there's a strong, or they have a vast working knowledge of a historical topic or the law or something like that, just like vast minds that can understand vast structures of information and knowledge, and sometimes rather dogmatic or sectarian or even outlandish in what they think. And in that sense, you have Saturn as the ultimate outsider. Now, in modern astrology, everyone associates Uranus with this, but this is old news. Saturn has always held down that part of the symbolism of Aquarius, and especially once you understand Saturn's relationship to the 12th house in traditional astrology as well. But, okay, so that's a brief answer as to the difference between rulership in Capricorn versus Aquarius. Next. Okay. Nicole says, I wanted to bring up a question about outer planets and their assigned rulerships in modern astrology. Here it is. Specifically, the meanings that have been ascribed to the sign of Aquarius due to the modern assignment to Uranus. Is there any reference in traditional astrology to the modern generic meanings ascribed to it? Community, humanitarian, etc. No, but here's where a lot of this comes from. The planet Uranus and its association with all of these sort of wild, eccentric, outsider, dissident, inventive, original, those are spot on. Like that's all Uranus. But Aquarius is not a disruptive sign, right? It's not a sign that disrupts things. It's a sign that stabilizes things because it's a very Saturnine sign. This is why I try to make the case over and over again that although I love the outer planets, I don't think that they have a place as sign rulers. I think a lot of traditional astrologers believe this. The more that you start to understand the complex ways in which dignities and rulerships were originally configured, it was a very elaborate schemata, and so I don't believe that outer planets should be sign rulers, first of all. That does not mean that there aren't interesting archetypal associations between, the signs and the outer planets, like Pluto and, Pluto. But here's the way I think about it. It's not that Pluto is scorpionic. It's that Pluto is a little bit Mars-like. But Pluto is also very different from Mars. Uranus is a little Saturnine. It's very different than Saturn, however. Neptune, it's a little Jupiterian, but it's a lot different than Jupiter too. The signs should be thought of more closely in relation to their traditional rulers. The outer planets should be thought of as their own thing. They're a bit like fixed stars. They have, they're super powerful. Their archetypes are their own. They're unique. I don't think they need to be shoehorned into the classical system of dignities. And in fact, it seems really nonsensical to me because once you understand how they worked and how they were used in delineation, I don't think that there's as meaningful a place as a lot of people would think that there is. But that's a whole can of worms I won't get into now. And I wouldn't begrudge anyone for using them as rulers or anything. Like people are free to do what they want. I don't use them for that reason. So, but the question is, Uranus, does it have any association with community, humanitarian, etc.? So here's the thing is that Saturn is the ruler of Aquarius, and Saturn is the dimmest and most distant of the planets. It was traditionally took its joy in the 12th house, which is a place of abandonment, exile, ruin, shipwreck, hospitalization, sickness, slavery, disease, dark night of the soul. Saturn is also the sort of watcher on the edge of worlds, between the visible and the invisible, between the planetary spheres and the heavenly realm beyond them. Saturn is the closest out to the heavenly realm. Saturn has always had a very deep and mystical kind of signification. So when people say, oh, it's Saturn, and Saturn is so limiting and constraining and whatever, it's like, that's just a really ignorant understanding of Saturn. Saturn does include restriction, conservative qualities, rigidity, but just like Mars isn't just violence and punching you in the face, there's a lot more to Mars than that. There's always been a lot more to Saturn as well. Saturn is, in alchemy, Saturn is like the Negredo. Saturn is that deep, dark blackness of the black, that like the dark night of the soul that comes right along with any form of enlightenment. There's the death, there's the autumn, there's the winter. Saturn is a wintry planet. So we need that. It's an archetypal necessity. It's part of life. Now, Saturn, as the ruler of Aquarius, is thus also like the 12th house, and its joy in the 12th house. Saturn is related to that which is cast out. Saturn himself was cast out of heaven in ages past by his son Zeus. So Saturn is a downcast or outcast or excommunicated or fallen figure. Well, think of all the heretics with new scientific ideas. Think of all the outcasts who are marginalized in our society today. Think of the pain that they experience and that they endure, and yet also the way that they carry the mantle of change in our world. That's Saturn. Saturn is the scapegoat. Saturn is the one people blame. Saturn is the in a sense, the victim of conspiracy to get rid of that which we don't like or we don't want. So when we villainize Saturn, we are actually, it's a very ironic way in which we are epitomizing the darkness of Saturn in the way that we're characterizing Saturn. So for this reason, people often notice some really beautiful, maybe qualities about Saturn in Aquarius or something like that. And maybe they think, oh, we need a ruler that can, we need a planetary ruler that has all of these affinities with progress and change and humanitarianism. And two things. One is that Saturn very adequately carries the burden of being the outcast, the outsider, the rebel, the humanitarian. Because what is humanitarianism about? It's about helping people who are suffering. That's a Saturn role. It's taking an active role in the world in relation to that which is fallen or cast out. So there's a relation to those things in Aquarius, however, there's also fundamentalist dogmatic rigidity in Aquarius. So very similarly, Uranus is a planet that can be super rigid. People don't like to think about this a lot with Uranus because we wear rose-colored glasses sometimes about the outer planets, but Uranus can be, just downright malefic. Like Uranus disrupts, disturbs, shocks, throws out of order, throws things into chaos. Uranus is sometimes very dogmatic, rigid ideologically, even if it's on the far left or the far right, doesn't matter. It's about rigid idealism or rigid, forms of dogma. Saturn can be the exact same way. So there's a lot of overlap that I think probably is related to why Uranus is initially associated with the Saturn-ruled sign. In fact, I don't remember where this is exactly, but there is a text that I have that shows the discovery chart for Uranus, when the time it was first discovered. And if I remember correctly, it was either a conjunction. Uranus was in a conjunction with Saturn when it was discovered, or it was in an opposition. I think it was a conjunction. So look at the discovery charts of when outer planets were discovered. They tell you a lot, actually, about what the outer planet is all about. We love to talk about the naming of the planets, the outer planets, but the discovery charts are also really important. So anyway, hopefully that gives you something to think about, Nicole. Thanks for your question. All right, next one. Astrocartography. Does it work? Does it hold water? What is it? Okay, so I'm not an expert on astrocartography. I think it's pretty cool though. It's a more recent thing. Basically, you're looking at how your think about your birth chart and how the planets in your birth chart are positioned or repositioned in different parts of the world. So, for example, in India, which is I own a yoga studio. I'm a student of Bhakti Yoga. In India, not far from where I really kind of the center of my spiritual practice and tradition that I study was formed. The sun is on the midheaven of that point in the world for me, which is a very high kind of important position, right? So a lot of the times what you're looking at is you're looking at the way that your planets in your birth chart are reconfigured into different positions in the chart, the way the chart kind of reorients itself in different parts of the world. I think it's really valid. Like even if like sometimes person will have really strong energy from, some certain part of the world. And even if they are, in the United States and they never go to that part of the world, they marry someone from that part of the world or stuff like that. So I do think that astrocartography holds water. I think it's very interesting. It's a newer development in astrology. You also have to be careful because there's like, I don't know, I'm not the expert on this at all, but there is an astrocartography like TM that like can't be used by anyone else. And it's like one of those yoga programs where it's like Bikram or something where you have to sign up and do the things that they do. And you can't call yourself an astrocartographer unless you have, I don't know, some kind of certification or I don't know. I'm just thinking there's something like that. Whereas a lot of people practice it without necessarily calling themselves an astrocartographer. So I think the word astrocartography has some kind of red tape around it. But again, I'm not the person that, so I might be speaking very ignorantly about this. So if someone knows, please feel free to correct me. All right. Is it possible that the energies would potentiate during short as well as longer stays in a place in a different part of the world? Yeah, they could be. I mean, I've heard stories of people who have, just continually rotten experiences in one particular part of the country, even when they're stopping in for like weekend business, and then it's just that they have a Mars, like nasty Mars in that spot or something like that. So yeah, I definitely think it's real. Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. All right, going on. Historically, when did astrologers begin using planetary declination? How much do you typically give it when reading natal charts or predictive work? Not a lot. And my honest answer is I have no idea. I don't know when declination first became a thing, but I'm guessing it was probably a good long time ago because declination is, it's an important way of basically looking at planets. But at any rate, I'm not going to go into that because that's a pretty technical concept and one that I'm afraid I might get wrong without doing a little brushing up first. So, who it would be someone would be good to ask that question would be Chris Brennan. My colleague, Chris Brennan, ask him, send him a message on Facebook, Lisa, because he may know that answer more quickly than I do. All right, next one. Here, Adam, I remember hearing, this comes from Kathy. I remember hearing that during the Reagan presidency, unsavory or unpopular information would be released to the public when the moon was void of course. Yeah, I've heard that too. The reason being that purportedly people would hear about it. By the way, for those who don't know, Reagan had an astrologer. And he pawned it off on his wife. Like, oh, it's my wife who has the astrologer. But reportedly, the astrologer herself has said that she was, Johnny on the spot for the president. The reason being that purportedly people would hear about it and then just pass it off, not reacting or doing anything about it, or not remembering it as anything of importance. Do you think this is a valid idea? I mean, I could see why the astrologer might try that. Whether that actually worked or not, I don't know. I was a little kid when Reagan was president, so I don't know. But I think it's an interesting idea, and it wouldn't surprise me if he had an astrologer, if that astrologer would have been doing something like that. Whether it works or not, I'm a little skeptical. All right. Another question from Laura. I have a question. All the chart or transit interpretations I read or listened to tend to blend together so that all planets in a sign are read the same and all aspects are read the same. For example, the sun in Gemini is like the moon in Gemini is like any planet in Gemini, and is like the sun aspecting Mercury either by hard or by soft aspect, all the same. Can you do a video discussing these differences? My Virgo is frustrated. So first of all, there should be a club called My Virgo is Frustrated. You named it. That's your new hashtag. But secondly, you're right. And I'm very passionate about this. I'm going to get up on a little bit of a soapbox here and just say that I think that part of this stems from, in modern astrology, everyone has stereotypes about Gemini. So when people read a bunch of planets in Gemini or any kind of planet in Gemini, they just talk about Gemini. In ancient astrology, it's very different because the organizational methods that you have for making an interpretation are very different depending on which planet you're ruling, which house it rules, or which houses it rules, what aspects it has, whether it's a daytime or a nighttime chart, what kind of essential dignity the planet has, what part of its synodic cycle with the sun it's in. Is it just station? Is it retrograde? Ancient astrology is much more detailed in a lot of ways than modern astrology is. So where modern astrology might really succeed in being very psychologically descriptive, it often fails in being detailed enough and being able to differentiate things with a more fine-tooth comb. So my advice to you would be study traditional astrology, and shameless self-promotion, I have a course coming up in starts on Saturdays in December. So it's a 1-year course. It starts from the foundations of the earliest Greek astrology, works its way up to modern times, gives you a little bit of something of everything, but also helps you to become more organized and detailed so that you don't run into everything is like everything. And astrology just sometimes feels like BS when that's the case, doesn't it? So I sympathize with you, Laura. Thanks for your question. All right, another one from Iris. Thank you for the wonderful talk about Scorpio. I found it life-affirming and helpful. Good. Nice. Could you continue speaking about planets in fall or detriment? To start, Mercury is in Sagittarius now. Could you talk about its deeper meaning? Okay, simple enough. Planets in their rulership are comfortable. If they're in their home sign, they're like, hey, I'm in my own house, so I can give myself what I need. If the planet is in the sign opposite to its own sign, so if the moon in Cancer, right, home sign, happy, I can make myself a meal, I can cuddle up on the couch, I can do lunar things that make me feel good. Simple, right? So it's being simple and stereotypical here, but go to the opposite sign of Capricorn, and suddenly you're like, you want a nice warm couch to sleep on? I'm going to give you a rock and a ruler. Do you know what I mean? Or I'd like a nice home-cooked meal, and like, yeah, well, I think you should walk through the rain for your meal. You know what I mean? I'm making these up. These are gross exaggerations. But when the reason that it's in its detriment when it's in Capricorn is because it's in Saturn's sign. So it is trying to get its needs met by its host. Who is its host? Its host is Saturn. Saturn is the one that has to provide for it. What can Saturn give the moon that the moon will like? Well, it can only give it of its own nature. So Saturn, planet of coldness, winteriness, isolation, difficulty, death, old age, disease, but also wisdom, is giving it something that it needs, something that it wants or desires. So Saturn will give the moon what it wants through its own nature. And the essential dignities, including detriments, are ways of telling us that the planet is uncomfortable, generally speaking, in terms of the relationship it has to the host of the sign that it's in and how that host will try to meet its needs. So Mercury, very comfortable in Virgo, very uncomfortable in Pisces, very comfortable in Gemini, very uncomfortable in Sagittarius. Why? Mercury's analytical. Mercury likes to deconstruct, throw things up in the air, debate, wonder about, but not make decisions maybe. Or Mercury likes to interpret and reinterpret and flip things around. Mercury likes to, let's say, think things over back and forth. Okay, that's what Mercury likes. So how does Mercury get that done when it's in Sagittarius' sign, which is Jupiter's sign? Jupiter can only do what? Well, let's say Jupiter's like, well, I'm the planet of abundance and growth and augmentation. So you want to think and rationalize and go back and forth about that stuff? Okay, I'll just make that bigger, right? It could be like that. You could be a nervous mess. Or Mercury's like, I'd really like to think through an issue. And Jupiter's like, well, I'm the planet of certainty and belief and like cocksure confidence. Well, how well does that work for Mercury, who likes to think through things carefully? Suddenly, your better, more logical, careful thinking mind goes out the window and you become all puffed up and proud and you haven't checked your work and you submit something that's full of errors. So you get the point. The combination is more stressful. It's Mercury trying to get its needs met with a planetary host that's sort of its polar opposite. The same thing is true for exaltations and depressions. So for example, Jupiter is exalted in the sign of Cancer, which is the beginning of summer. It's a very abundant, watery, fertile, solar, yang time of year, just perfect for Jupiter, who likes growth and abundance and fertility and good fortune and wisdom and faith. Put it in the opposite sign of Capricorn, and it is in the exaltation of Mars. Mars is made strong at the beginning of winter in Capricorn, where there's the theme of death and darkness is pronounced, as well as the slow, gradual return of light. Mars excels in that environment because it's a bitter, cold, hard, dark place. And Mars is the lesser malefic, and Mars kind of can put his back into things in the winter a bit too. So it's in the winter, it's kind of like you have to have a sort of a fierce spirit, so if you think of the Northmen in Game of Thrones or something like that. Sorry, someone the other day was really pissed that I made Game of Thrones references. They were like, well, I really liked your talk all the way until you started making Game of Thrones references, and then it complicated everything even more. And I was like, I'm just really sorry for you. I feel really sorry for you that you don't like Game of Thrones, but otherwise, sorry. I'm not going to stop. So anyway, Mars in Capricorn, that was a bit like the Northmen in Game of Thrones, or you could say, it's like a group of an expedition in the winter that has to forge through the darkness with some kind of steely resolve. It's not the place Jupiter's really excited about. You know what I mean? So Jupiter in its fall in Capricorn, whereas Mars, not as excited in the like hot and fertile summery time. It gets really maybe excessively hot and crabby during that time. So you think these kinds of planetary opposites, though, in the ancient language of dignities, tell us about what a planet naturally is and what it desires, what kinds of environments it thrives in, and what kind of environments it does not thrive in relative to the planetary dynamics that it shares in different signs. So this language is largely not used in modern astrology, which is unfortunate because it really helps us with that same question the last reader had about how do you make things a little bit more detailed. Essential dignities really, really help because they give you conceptual apparatus to help make interpretations and become more like fine-tuned with them. So, all right. Thanks, Iris, for your question. All right, let's see. Next one. I'm blazing through them now. Someone found me on Astrology Hubs. This is Mirnalini. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. Found me on Astrology Hub's online seminar, and I was the favorite. Well, good. I had to have at least one person that thought I was a good one on there. I didn't get a lot of feedback after that, so that's cool to hear. Thank you. How do you reconcile Jupiter and Sagittarius in Western astrology with Jupiter and Scorpio in Vedic? Well, I don't have to reconcile them, mostly because there's no need to. They're two different systems that both work. Think about it like this. There's Thoth Tarot, the Thoth Tarot deck, and then there's the Rider-Waite Tarot deck. Two totally different decks, mostly the same kind of system. But, you may pull one card in one system, one in the other. They're the same card. They look very different. That's one way of thinking about the difference sort of conceptually. Because these are forms of divination, in my opinion, the discrepancies between whether a planet is in the sidereal sign of Scorpio or the tropical sign of Sagittarius, to me is somewhat irrelevant when remembering that at core, this is a symbolic language that is supposed to be symbolically speaking. The divine is speaking through the symbolic apparatus of the language. The language, it's important to retain the dignity of it. It's not like you can just say and do anything. It has a coherence to it. It's a language. There's different dialects, you could say, and the different dialects have different ways of speaking to the truth of what's going on. Some people will say, oh, well, that means there is no accurate or objective astrology. And I'm just saying, no, rather than thinking of astrology like a science, you need to think of it like a symbolic oracular language, a symbol, a set of signs and omens that are speaking to, they're speaking to things that are happening, that have happened, or that will happen. And just slightly, the East and West are just slightly different dialects. And sometimes the discrepancies are really big, and they can be, come down to fundamental sort of disagreements about the way things are happening or the way things are being interpreted or something like that. But most of the time I find that it's not a huge deal. But I will say that I think that it's confusing to try and spend all your time reconciling them, or to spend your time going back and forth between them. Some people do it with relative ease. I don't think it's a good idea. I think, stick with a system, kind of entrain yourself to one of the languages that you resonate with. And I think it works better that way. That does not mean you have to invalidate the other one either. So, yeah, I hope that this is a helpful answer. How does one reconcile planetary transits between the Vedic year, tropical year, even the Mayan one? Well, I can't speak to the Mayan one, but hopefully I answered your question otherwise. You could also just say that, get a reading from a Vedic astrologer, get a reading from, Western astrologer, which one feels more honest, not which one feels better, like good, but which one feels more honest, and which one feels like it speaks to you more, and which system, when you follow the transit, speaks to you more. And but be careful not to play the game of, one's accurate, the other's not objectively. So we're trying to overly rationalize, and sort of, we're using an approach, a kind of empirical approach that isn't exactly right for understanding astrology. Okay, so thank you for that question. Dear Adam, this is from Jacob. I'm wondering about your thoughts regarding the designation of the sun sign we were born into. I feel like it may be a simplification to consider Pisces an old soul, as opposed to someone who may be just starting out, like an Aries. Do you believe in that kind of designation? No, that's stupid. If people tell you that you're born a Pisces and you're an old soul, you should slap them across the face. Just right away, and just be like, look, old souls don't slap people, right? Just disprove them, just disprove them right there. They're like, you're a Pisces, so you're an old soul. Especially if it's a guy who's trying to pick up on you somewhere, and they're like, oh, you're a Pisces, you must be an old soul. Just be like, you don't know astrology, and I will not date you. Just end it right there. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so no, there's nothing to this. Nowhere in the history of traditional astrology is there any indication that astrologers ever, for thousands of years, said that your sun sign determined the age of your soul. Okay, so where does that come from? It comes from modern New Age woo-woo. So just throw it out. That's my opinion. I don't think I can be too much more generous than that. What is your reasoning behind the sign we are born into? Well, the sun sign that you're born into is hugely important, right? That's the sign that the sun was moving through when you were born. And it says a great deal about your life, especially depending on whose planetary house you were in. If you were born with the sun in Gemini, you were born with the sun, which is one of the main symbols signifying the life path as a whole. It's one of the most universal signifiers in the chart. Then your life is really not just governed by, sun in Gemini in some behavioral sense, but it means you're a child of Mercury. You're a child of Hermes. That's the home of Mercury that your sun was in when you were born. So sun sign will tell you a lot about character and life path and destiny. And, but it depends. If you were born with the sun in Mercury, and then Mercury's in the 12th house, you're a child of Hermes, but maybe you have trouble expressing yourself or communicating with other people, or being, you have mental or, maybe some mental health problems, or even learning problems or something like that. Some 12th house like challenges. Or you could be, more hermetic and sort of isolated. If you're born with the sun in, Scorpio, and Mars is at the top of the sky, you might be a really assertive, kind of combative, aggressive person. But it's never as simple as the sun sign. It's never as simple as the sun sign. People are always like, what's your sign? It's a sun sign. That is very new in the history of astrology. It's a much more complicated task to interpret the full chart of somebody using things like dignities, aspectual configurations, accidental dignities, all sorts of stuff. So again, my call to people, if you're interested in this stuff, if this stuff like really gets your mind and your spirit going, come check out the class that I'm taking, because come check out the class that I'm offering this December. Lots of people are signing up and taking the class over the years. I get the same kind of feedback from people, which is that I really didn't know a lot about traditional astrology, and knowing now what they know about traditional astrology plus what they already knew about astrology coming from a more modern standpoint, they feel like, just much more well-rounded, and you can read charts in a much more grounded and accurate way. All right, so that's my pitch. Thank you, Jacob, for that question. And then last but not least is Paco saying, it seems like you're interested in Hindu practices like meditation and yoga. May I ask why you don't study Jyotish, which is sometimes also referred to as Indian or Vedic astrology? Good question. The main reason for this is that I've always been into, yoga. It's been in the West. So when I first started learning astrology, it was in the West. It was tropical system. It was, modern psychological and evolutionary astrology. And then gradually I started getting into Hellenistic and, Renaissance and medieval astrology, horary astrology and things like that. And as that was happening, my commitment and interest in the bhakti yoga path was growing. But I'd already got, I'm already really deep into the development of my Western practice. So it's not for lack of serious interest in Vedic cosmology, in, things like the Bhagavad Gita, the Puranas, the Yoga Sutras, those are, I've read those texts and I love them. And they're, so my daily rhythm is, very committed to the path of Bhakti Yoga. And I think I take a lot more than people think sometimes from the theology and sort of spiritual beliefs of the, Bhakti tradition. But I don't see any incompatibility with the spiritual path I'm on and practicing Western astrology either. I think they go together just fine. So in other words, one doesn't need to become a Jyotish astrologer if one is, practicing a spiritual practice from India. But at the same time, I feel it very passionately that in the years to come, I have a sense. There's this amazing temple that I visited last year when I was in India called the Temple of the Vedic Planetarium. And one of the intentions of building this temple, which will have the biggest dome in the world, even bigger than the Vatican by the time it's done, one of the intentions is to bring together astrologers from both the East and the West to commune and talk about how the spiritual roots of astrology from East and West are very similar. I'm giving several talks at conferences in 2019 on the similarities between early Greek mystical philosophy and, Indian philosophy, the similarities between things like Buddhism, Jainism, yoga, and things like Platonism and Stoicism and things like that. So there's a book called The Shape of Ancient Thought by Thomas McKivalry, if I remember his last name correctly. But he wrote a book which is a comparative study between early Greek and Indian philosophy. And that correspondence, that kind of interchange of philosophies and beliefs that took place between the East and the West was happening right at the time when astrology was taking off. And interestingly enough, in India today, the practice of natal astrology, of having your birth chart read, is still being practiced basically very closely to the way that it was being practiced 2,000 years ago. And I think the fact that I practice Hellenistic astrology, which is the sort of oldest form of Western astrology, puts me among Western astrologers sort of closest to my Vedic brothers and sisters. So, early Hellenistic astrology is very, very similar to Indian astrology. In fact, one of the earliest texts that you find in the Vedic astrology tradition, the Jyotish, is called the Yavana Jataka. The Yavana Jataka, the translation of that Sanskrit, is the astrology of the Greeks. And you'll see that there are many actually transliterated technical concepts that have no actual name in Sanskrit that come from the Greeks. So the astrologies are much more similar than they are different when you get down to practicing old school astrology as well. So in practicing Hellenistic astrology, I already feel very, very close to the way that Indian astrology is practiced. And I saw this firsthand when I was speaking at an East meets West astrology conference in Calcutta last year. I got to see how similar in many regards the Hellenistic astrology is compared to the Vedic astrology. More similarities than differences, I think. So hopefully that answers your question, Paco. But I think I'd like to keep learning more too, because as my path with Bhakti deepens, like I'm going back to India this winter, I just feel like, there's more interesting crossovers to learn about and hopefully, blend into my work. So thanks a lot for that question, Paco. And that is the end. That is all my questions. I caught up with all of them. Thank you. If you ever have a question, you can email me, nightlightastrology@gmail.com. Put YouTube Q&A in the subject line, and I will put it in the basket and get to another Q&A session soon. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.